As he settled in, Lee scanned the room, a habit from his military days. Always Roy Lee, a 58-year-old black veteran, bore hands calloused by a life once full of honor. He'd fought in Iraq, sacrificed for his country, but now Lee was just a homeless man, wandering Willow Creek, Georgia, carrying an old backpack stuffed with a silver medal and a crumpled military ID. All he wanted was the cheapest cup of coffee, a simple warmth to fend off the biting cold. But in Willow Creek, a town where prejudice simmered beneath a veneer of Southern hospitality, even a cup of coffee could become a battleground. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Willow Creek bathed in the pale light of a sluggish winter day, its quaint little shops and bare trees, the picture of Southern calm. But beneath this idyllic surface, invisible currents of tension ran deep. Like many towns across America, Willow Creek harbored long-standing prejudice and unspoken division, simmering just below the facade, ready to erupt in a confrontation that would shake the town to its roots. Lee stepped into the cafe, the small bell jingling above the door, bringing the street's chill with him. His tattered coat and thick beard drew a few glances, but he kept his head down, choosing a small table near a fogged-up window. His slow steps carried the weight of forgotten years. His dark eyes, though dulled by age and pain, still held a spark of the young man he'd once been, full of hope when he first donned his uniform. Leroy Lee pushed open the door of Sunny Haven Café, pausing for a second as the warmth inside enveloped him. The piercing cold of Willow Creek melted from his skin, but the unease in his chest lingered, a small flame that never died. He took a deep breath, the scent of fresh coffee, mingling with smoky bacon hitting his nose, a luxury he'd rarely savored since losing everything. With measured steps, Lee moved to the small table near the window, where faint light filtered through the misty glass. He set his worn backpack on the floor, the faint clink of loose change, and his silver medal sounding like a quiet reminder of days gone by. The vinyl chair creaked softly as he sat, and Lee straightened his back out of old military habit, a trace of dignity he still clung to, even as the world outside saw him as invisible. Before stepping in here, Lee had steeled himself in his own way. Out in the frigid air, he'd stood by a public faucet under a bridge, splashing icy water onto his bearded face. It seeped into old scars, jolting him awake, though his hands trembled from the cold. He peered into a jagged piece of glass propped up as a makeshift mirror, seeing a weathered man he barely recognized, graying temples, eyes clouded by sleepless nights and war memories. For a fleeting moment, the reflection flickered, and Lee saw himself as a young recruit, back straight, eyes bright, standing in his uniform for the first time at boot camp. Back then, he'd believed his sacrifice would earn him a better future. But the image faded as quickly as it came, leaving Lee facing reality, a homeless man cast aside by society, now just hoping for a coffee to warm his hands. He carefully unzipped his old army coat, each torn seam telling a story of forgotten years. Inside the pocket, he checked his few coins, cold metal scraps he'd scavenged from Willow Creek sidewalks that morning. Enough to pay, he told himself, though he knew in a place like this, money wasn't always the issue. Lee had heard whispers around town about Sunny Haven Café, a spot with fragrant coffee and a cozy vibe, but he'd never dared enter. The old haunts where he'd once been a familiar face, before PTSD took everything, had either shut down or changed hands. Today, the cold and hunger pushed him past his fear of rejection, turning this cafe into a chance for a fleeting peace, even if just for a few minutes. Ting details. The worn but clean wooden floor, mismatched chairs adding charm to the space, and a few local paintings on the walls, like small windows into Willow Creek's soul. The place was fairly busy, with families nibbling breakfast, lone patrons engrossed in newspapers, and in the far corner, a group of bikers he'd glimpsed on his way in. They wore leather jackets studded with patches, some sporting thick beards, but their occasional laughter cut through the cafe's low hum. Lee felt a twinge of unease, that familiar sensation of stepping into unfamiliar territory. But he told himself he'd faced far worse: bomb-filled nights in Iraq, losing comrades, and those first days sleeping on the streets. A young waitress, her name tag reading Tessa Brooks, approached with a hesitant smile. Her eyes crinkled at the corners as she looked at Lee, as if wanting to say something, but holding back. Her friendliness reminded him of his daughter, long estranged after he couldn't hold his family together amid nightmares. "Hi, sir," Tessa said, her voice soft but genuine. "What can I get you?" Lee smiled back, his deep, warm voice carrying the weight of years. "Hi, miss," he replied, "just a black coffee, if that's all right." Tessa nodded, pointing toward the counter. "I'll grab it for you. That's a good spot. You can watch the street while you wait." As Tessa walked off, Lee glanced around again, taking in the faces. He saw families chatting, kids' voices a bright spot in the room. At the counter, a few solo diners sipped coffee over spread-out newspapers. The bikers in the corner kept talking, their presence an unexpected note in the warm setting. Lee felt a mix of caution and hope. He'd lived long enough to know appearances could deceive, that smiles didn't always mean welcome. But he'd also seen enough of the world to know kindness could sometimes come from the unlikeliest places. He took a deep breath, pushing down his unease, focusing on the coffee smell to come. A moment of peace he hoped wouldn't break. But deep down, Lee knew in Willow Creek, even the simplest things could turn into a challenge. Leroy Lee sat still at the small corner table in Sunny Haven Café, his calloused hands resting lightly around his old backpack, as if to keep it close. The aroma of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air, stirring hunger in his stomach, a familiar pang he'd learned to ignore. He tapped a finger on the table, waiting for the black coffee Tessa Brooks, the young waitress, had gone to fetch. Through the fogged window, Lee caught a glimpse of Willow Creek outside, but his mind wasn't there. He focused on this moment, hoping it would pass smoothly, a rare bit of calm in his harsh life. But when the kitchen's swinging door burst open, that hope dissolved. Ray Hargrove, the owner, stepped out, his bald head gleaming under the cafe lights. Ray, a man in his 50s, carried a confident air as he surveyed his domain, nodding to regulars, with a polite smile. But when his eyes landed on Lee, that warmth chilled. Ray's smile faltered, then twisted into a clear frown. Lee felt a familiar cold run down his spine, the kind he'd met too often, from roadside diners to dark street corners. It was a wordless look that said, "You don't belong here." For a split second, Lee considered standing and leaving, dodging the confrontation he knew was coming. But a lifetime of fighting on Iraq's battlefields and Willow Creek streets had taught him to stand his ground. He stayed put, his hand tightening on the backpack strap almost unconsciously. Tessa returned with a steaming coffee, its rich scent easing Lee for a moment. "Here you go, sir," she said, setting it down with a shy smile. "Anything else you need?" Lee opened his mouth to reply, when Ray approached, each step ratcheting up the tension. He looked up, meeting Ray's eyes, a glare of anger mixed with fear, one Lee had seen too often in those facing their own prejudice. Ray's voice rasped when he spoke, each word spat out with restrained effort. "We're full up today," he said, his tone quivering, despite its attempt at authority. "You need to leave." Lee blinked, briefly stunned by the blatant lie. He glanced around. Empty tables and counter seats were plain to see. "Sorry," Lee began, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of years facing trials, "but it looks like there's space. Is something wrong?" He locked eyes with Ray, unwavering, though a familiar weariness crept into his bones. Ray's face flushed, his prejudice overriding reason. His voice rose as he pressed, "I said we're full. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." The words echoed through the now silent cafe, drawing every eye to them. Lee felt a weight on his chest, not fear, but the familiar ache of facing discrimination he'd once hoped to help erase. Slowly, he stood, his movements deliberate yet resolute, hand bracing the table for balance. His hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the effort to suppress the anger and humiliation burning inside. "Sir," Lee said, his deep voice carrying across the quiet space. "I'm not looking for trouble. I just want a coffee, like everyone else here." His tone held the patience of a man who'd faced this scene dozens of times, but beneath it lay a profound sadness, exhaustion with a world that hadn't changed. Ray shot back instantly, his voice harsh and unyielding. "Your kind isn't welcome here," he snarled. "This is a decent place. Get out now, you filthy beggar." The words hung in the air, sharp and cruel, shocking in their bald prejudice. A collective gasp rose from the cafe crowd, other patrons finally registering the drama unfolding. Lee felt like he'd been stabbed, not by a blade, but by how easily Ray stripped away his humanity. He looked around, noting reactions, some shocked, some avoiding his gaze, and a few, to Lee's heavy heart, seeming to nod in agreement with Ray. Lee's eyes landed on Tessa. Her face was a mask of horror, hands gripping her tray until her knuckles whitened. She looked pained, clearly against Ray, but too scared to speak. Maybe this job was all she had. Lee felt a pang of empathy for her, recalling his daughter, whom he no longer saw. The silence in the cafe was deafening, as if everyone held their breath, waiting to see what he'd do. Lee felt the weight of every stare, expectations, judgments, and indifference hanging in the air. In that moment, sitting in the cafe, he'd hoped would bring some warmth. Lee felt the full burden of his years. He thought of times he'd been turned away from diners across the country, nights sleeping rough when no one offered a hand, and days in the military, when he believed his sacrifice mattered. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, knowing he had two choices: walk away quietly, letting Ray's bigotry go unchallenged, or stand firm, asserting his right to be treated as human. The soldier in him, who'd survived bombs and loss, had only one option. He wouldn't back down. With a slow motion, Lee reached into his coat pocket, his hand trembling from the effort to hold back emotion. He pulled out his military ID, the worn plastic still legible. "I served this country for over 20 years, he said, his voice laced with pride and sorrow. "Bled so you could stand here today." The words hung heavy, resonating through the cafe, but Ray didn't flinch. His face reddened further, a flash of shame crossing it before new anger took over. "I don't care who you are or what you've done," Ray roared, his voice cracking with agitation. "Get out now, or I'll call the cops." The threat lingered, a stark reminder of the injustice Lee had faced his whole life. Lee stood there, still holding his ID, humiliation and rage surging within. He'd fought enemies in Iraq, endured war's horrors, all for a country that still saw him as disposable. But as he turned to leave, a sound shattered the tense silence, a chair scraping loudly across the floor, piercing and sharp, coming from the corner where the bikers sat. The scrape of a chair on Sunny Haven Cafe's wooden floor rang out sharply, slicing through the stifling silence that gripped the room. Leroy Lee, still standing with his military ID in hand, turned his head, his deep black eyes flickering with curiosity and caution. From the far corner, the group of bikers he'd noticed on entering rose as one. Their leader, a tall man with a grizzled beard, strode toward Lee and Ray with purposeful steps. His leather jacket glinted under the lights, military patches on the shoulder, a silent declaration. Behind him, the other bikers fell into line, their presence commanding attention as every eye in the cafe turned to them. Lee's heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the surprise of this twist. The leader stopped a few steps from Lee and Ray, his sharp eyes scanning both men. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried a steely edge that demanded notice. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" he asked, his gaze locking onto Ray. Lee recognized something in him. Not the face, but the stance, the tone. A fellow veteran, like himself. Ray, so bold when facing Lee, now looked startled. His eyes darted around the cafe, as if just realizing he was being watched. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he tried to regain his toughness. "This isn't your business," Ray snapped, his voice shaky despite its attempt at authority. "It's between me and this guy." He jabbed a hand toward Lee, taking a small step back, as if to distance himself. Lee stood still, gripping his ID, his breathing slowing as he took in the scene. He wavered between leaving to avoid more trouble and staying to see what the bikers would do. Decades of experience had taught him caution, but something in the leader's demeanor made him pause. The air in the cafe shifted, tension lingered, now mixed with anticipation. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, eager to see what came next. The biker leader, introducing himself as Vincent Vince Malone, kept his eyes on Ray. "We couldn't help overhearing your conversation," Vince said, his voice steady but weighty, "and we've got a few things to say about it." Ray, his face now a mix of anger and unease, tried to reclaim his authority. "This is my cafe," he stammered, his voice rising with agitation. "I can serve who I want." Vince nodded slowly, a gesture both understanding and dissenting. "Sure, it's your place," he acknowledged. "But rights come with responsibilities, and one of those is treating people with respect, especially someone who's bled for this country." As he spoke, Vince reached into his leather jacket. Ray flinched, clearly expecting the worst, but what Vince pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a worn leather wallet. He drew his own military ID, holding it up for all to see. "See," Vince continued, his voice now carrying a depth of emotion, "a lot of us are veterans too. We fought alongside people like him." He gestured toward Lee, men and women of every color, every background. A murmur rippled through the cafe as Vince's words sank in. Lee felt his throat tighten, an unexpected wave of emotion rising, surprise, gratitude, and something like a connection he hadn't felt in years. Vince wasn't done. He signaled his crew, and one by one, they stepped forward. Some held up military IDs, others rolled up sleeves to reveal army tattoos, marks of their years of service. Jamal Hayes, a black biker with graying temples, moved to Vince's side. His eyes blazed with restrained anger as he stared at Ray. "We bled with folks of every shade," Jamal said firmly, his voice ringing clear in the quiet space. "Your prejudice has no place here, no place anywhere." Ray, realizing he was outnumbered, grew more defensive. His face twisted, hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "This is my cafe," he shouted, his voice nearly breaking in a frantic outburst. "I decide who stays." Vince remained calm in the face of Ray's eruption. "We've got the right to take our business elsewhere," he replied, his tone unshaken. "But first, you owe this man an apology." He gestured toward Lee, who watched with a mix of surprise and appreciation. But Ray was beyond reason. "Get out," he roared, his face flushed with rage. "All of you, this is my place." Vince met Ray's gaze with a calm, piercing look. "You'll regret this," he said, his low voice carrying the weight of a promise, not a threat of violence, but a certainty of consequences. Lee, silent through the exchange, felt a whirlwind of emotions. He valued this unexpected support, but worried about the escalating situation. He didn't want violence. He'd seen enough in his life. Vince, seeming to sense Lee's unease, turned to him with a reassuring nod. "Don't worry," he said softly, just for Lee to hear. "We've got our own way of handling this." The other bikers nodded in agreement, a clear resolve in their eyes. With a signal from Vincent, the bikers began filing out of the cafe. As they passed Lee, each offered a nod of respect, or a whispered word of support. "Hang in there, man," Jamal said, clapping his shoulder lightly. Lee felt his throat tighten again, overwhelmed by this sudden solidarity. As the last biker stepped out, the cafe erupted in chatter. Ray, still red-faced with anger, retreated to the kitchen without another word. Tessa approached Lee timidly. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "Your coffee's on the house if you want to stay." Lee looked at her, then at the chaotic scene around him. He shook his head gently. "Thanks, but I think I'll go," he said, his voice low with exhaustion. He picked up his backpack and walked to the door, unaware that the bikers were waiting for him outside. Leroy Lee stepped out of Sunny Haven Cafe, the chill of Willow Creek wrapping around him again, as the door swung shut behind him. The small bell jingled one last time, like a bitter farewell. He stood on the sidewalk, his old backpack slung over one shoulder, his hand still gripping his military ID, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright after the clash with Raymond Ray Hargrove. But when he looked up, he froze, his breath catching for a moment. Before him, the biker group led by Vince Malone had gathered, their gleaming motorcycles lined up along the curb. They hadn't left as he'd assumed. They were gearing up for something bigger. Lee's heart beat faster, a mix of apprehension and hope stirring in him, something he hadn't felt in years. Vince turned to Lee, his sharp eyes softening with concern. "You okay, man?" he asked, his voice rough but sincere. Lee nodded slowly, still processing what had happened. "I'm fine," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I just thank you. You didn't have to do that." Vince placed a hand on Lee's shoulder, a gesture both comforting and respectful. "We always stand up for our own," he said firmly. "No veteran deserves to be treated like you were in there." The other bikers gathered around Lee, their leather jackets glinting in the dim light, patches and medals on their chests, telling tales of battles they'd endured. Lee found himself surrounded by a group he'd been wary of just minutes ago. Now, they were unexpected allies. The morning's quiet shattered as motorcycle engines roared to life. Vince signaled, and the bikers sprang into action. They propped up small signs beside their bikes, "Respect Veterans" and "Justice for Soldiers," scrawled in bold red paint on white backgrounds. Vince stepped to the center of the lineup, his voice carrying as he addressed a few curious passers-by who'd stopped. Today, a veteran was kicked out of this cafe just for his skin color and situation, he declared, pointing at Sunny Haven. "We're here to say that's not acceptable." Lee stood a few paces away, feeling the crowd's eyes shift to him. He bowed his head, unaccustomed to the attention, but couldn't deny a spark of warmth growing inside. For the first time in years, someone was fighting for him. Willow Creek buzzed to life. People poked their heads out of nearby shops, some stopping to snap photos with their phones. A small crowd formed, whispering among themselves, and Lee saw the community splitting. Some shook their heads, siding with Ray's right to run his business. "He can choose his customers," an older man said loudly enough for Lee to hear. But others, especially younger folks, began aligning with the bikers. Tessa Brooks, the young waitress, slipped out the cafe's back door, her eyes red as she looked at Lee. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything in there," she whispered, handing him a hastily wrapped roll. I can't lose this job." Lee nodded, appreciating her small kindness. The incident spread fast when Clara Evans, a local reporter from the Willow Creek Gazette, arrived with a camera and notepad. She interviewed Vince, jotting down every word. "We're veterans who fought for freedom," Vince explained, his voice calm yet forceful. "Today, we saw a brother treated like trash, just because he's black and homeless. That goes against everything we sacrificed for." Clara turned to Lee, but he shook his head slightly, not ready to speak. Instead, she snapped photos of the bikers and their bikes, posting the story online. Within hours, it went viral, racking up hundreds of shares and comments across Georgia. Ray, inside the cafe, couldn't sit still. He stormed to the door, his face flushed with fury as he saw the crowd and bikers. "What are you people doing?" he bellowed, his trembling hand pointing at Vince. "You can't do this. I'll call the cops." Vince turned, his demeanor steady but resolute. "Go ahead," he replied. "We're not breaking any laws, just a group wanting coffee at a local spot." Ray charged back inside, the door slamming behind him. Through the window, Lee saw him dialing a number, his frantic voice echoing out. Soon, a police siren wailed through the air. A patrol car pulled up, and a middle-aged officer stepped out, looking both puzzled and cautious. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone professional. Vince stepped forward, respectful but firm. "Hello, officer," he said. "We're a group of veterans peacefully protesting discrimination in this cafe. A brother of ours was refused service and insulted just for who he is." He gestured toward Lee. The officer looked at him, his eyes widening slightly, as he noticed the tattered army coat. "Mr. Carter?" he asked, as if the name rang a bell. Lee stepped up, his voice low but clear. "Yes, sir. I was thrown out just for my color, and because I don't have a home." Silence fell over the crowd as Lee spoke. Even passers-by stopped to listen. The officer nodded gravely, turning back to Vince. "And this is your response?" "Yes," Vince confirmed. "We're here peacefully, not blocking anything, not causing trouble." The officer considered for a moment, then nodded. "All right, as long as you keep it peaceful, you've got the right to be here." He turned away, leaving Ray to storm out again, his face twisted in disbelief. "You're letting them stay," he yelled. "They're ruining my business." The officer fixed Ray with a stern look. "They've got the right to protest. If what Mr. Carter says is true, you might want to rethink what's really hurting your business." As the officer left, the crowd grew larger. Some locals joined the bikers, voicing outrage at Lee's treatment. Clara kept reporting, Lee's story spreading further, drawing attention from nearby towns. Lee stood there, watching it unfold, sensing a shift in the air. What started as a personal slight had become a small movement, a moment for Willow Creek to face its prejudices. He hadn't expected stepping into the cafe that morning to lead to this. As the bikers held their ground, Lee felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, he thought, there were still people willing to fight for what's right, even in a town like this. Leroy Lee stood quietly on the sidewalk's edge in front of Sunny Haven Café, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his tattered army coat, his eyes tracking the line of biker motorcycles and the growing crowd outside the shop. The engine's roar had faded, replaced by the murmurs of Willow Creek residents and the soft chants from the Respect veterans, signs the bikers held high. The protest stretched into its third day, and the town's atmosphere had shifted, from initial curiosity to stark division. Some locals joined the bikers, bringing hot coffee and words of support, while others hung back, shaking their heads with disapproving glares. Lee felt the weight of every gaze, but this time, he didn't feel alone. Inside, Ray Hargrove faced his own nightmare. Through the fogged window, Lee saw Ray pacing behind the counter, his once flushed face now pale with stress. His phone rang non-stop, calls from regulars canceling reservations, suppliers questioning late payments. The once bustling cafe sat nearly empty, with only a few loyalists scattered about, their eyes avoiding Ray, as if he were contagious. Business had crumbled faster than he'd imagined, not because the bikers blocked the door, they stayed carefully on public pavement, but because Lee's story, spread by Clara Evans online, had turned Sunny Haven into a symbol of bigotry in the community's eyes. Ray had underestimated the power of collective outrage. Outside, Vincent Malone stood among the bikers, his voice carrying as he addressed the gathering crowd. "We're not here to destroy," he declared, holding a sign. "We're here to demand respect for him." He pointed at Lee, "and for everyone who's served this country." Vince's words fueled the fire of justice burning bright. An elderly woman stepped forward from the crowd, her voice trembling with emotion. "My husband was a veteran too," she said. "If he'd been treated like that, I'd never forgive it." Others nodded, and scattered applause broke out, making Ray flinch as he glanced out the window. Ray burst out again, his hands shaking with rage and desperation. "Haven't you had enough?" he shouted, his voice cracking in distress. "What do you want? To ruin me?" Vincent turned, his gaze calm but steely. "We want you to do the right thing," he replied. "Apologize to him." He gestured toward Lee, "and change how you run this place." Ray scoffed, but the sound was feeble, lacking its former strength. "I'm not apologizing to anyone," he growled. "This is my cafe. You can't force me." But as he looked around, seeing the growing crowd and the unfriendly stares, Ray's confidence began to waver. By the fourth day, the cafe teetered on collapse. Only one customer sat in a corner, and Tessa Brooks stood behind the counter, with a blank expression. Ray, now a shadow of himself, hunched over a desk in the kitchen, hands cradling his head. His phone sat silent. No one called anymore. Clara posted another article, with a video of Vince speaking outside, racking up thousands of views. Local businesses started shunning Ray, refusing deliveries once they learned he was in the eye of the storm. He tried calling a lawyer, but even they advised, "Cut your losses, Ray. You're not winning this one. Ray felt the walls crashing down, each piece of his pride shattering under pressure he couldn't control. That afternoon, Vince stepped up to the cafe door, the bikers standing behind him like a wall of solidarity. Ray emerged reluctantly, his eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness and strain. "I've got an offer for you," Vincent said, his voice even but carrying undeniable force. "We'll buy this place fair price. You take the money and walk away. We turn it into somewhere that welcomes everyone, no exceptions." Ray blinked, stunned by the proposal. He wanted to resist, but looking into Vince's steady eyes and the crowd beyond, he knew he had no options left. "You think I'd sell to you people?" he snarled, but the desperation was plain. Vince didn't budge. "You don't have many customers left to lose," he replied. "We've got cash, ready to sign today. You leave with something in your pocket, or wait until there's nothing." Ray glanced around, seeing the empty cafe, Tessa's bowed head behind the counter, and finally, Lee standing not far off, his eyes not judging but weary. The silence stretched, heavy, until Ray gave a weak nod. "Fine," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Take it." He turned inside, grabbed the paperwork, and signed with trembling hands, as if handing over his entire life. Lee was invited to witness the moment. He stood by Vince as Ray put down the pen, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. He hadn't wanted Ray to fall. He just wanted to be treated human. When the papers were done, Vince clapped Lee's shoulder. "This is your win," he said quietly. But Lee shook his head. "No," he replied, his voice low. "It's ours." Suddenly, a familiar figure stepped forward from the bikers. Jamal Hayes, who'd spoken up inside. He looked at Lee, eyes widening, as memory hit. "Carter?" Jamal asked, voice trembling. "Leroy Carter, 3rd Unit in Iraq?" Lee blinked, then nodded slowly. "Jamal?" The two embraced, a tight hug of men who'd survived hell together. The moment silenced the crowd, then applause broke out. Lee felt his throat tighten, tears welling up, not from sadness, but from this unexpected connection, amid years of being forgotten. Ray, having signed the papers, slipped away quietly, his figure disappearing around the street corner. Vincent turned to the bikers and the crowd. "We're going to turn this place into something better," he declared. "A place for everyone." Lee looked at the cafe, where just days ago he'd been kicked out, and for the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope, not just for himself, but for Willow Creek. But the story didn't end there. The bikers had bigger plans, and Lee was about to become part of them. After Ray Hargrove left, his figure fading around a Willow Creek corner, the biker group led by Vincent Malone wasted no time. Just days after signing the purchase, the sounds of hammers and drills echoed outside Sunny Haven Café. Leroy Lee stood at a distance, hands in the pockets of his tattered army coat, watching the bikers and a few locals clean and renovate together. Old signs came down, walls got fresh paint, and a new sign went up. Valor Haven Café, a name evoking courage and welcome, a stark contrast to what the place once stood for. Lee felt something unfamiliar, not just the building's transformation, but a shift in himself, a glimmer of hope he hadn't dared believe in days earlier. The bikers didn't just want a new cafe, they wanted a place to heal. With community help, they turned Valor Haven into a small hub for homeless veterans, a corner with sofas and warm blankets for temporary shelter, a bulletin board listing jobs and support services, and a coffee counter open to all, no matter their situation. Vince stood amid the emerging space, hammer in hand, his voice ringing out as he guided volunteers. "This isn't just a spot for coffee," he told the group. "It's a place where people can feel they belong." Lee heard those words, and for the first time in years, he felt he might be part of something bigger. Opening day came fast. Valor Haven Café debuted with laughter and soft music from small speakers. The walls now bore photos of veterans from all over, some bikers, some locals who'd served. Lee stepped in, invited by Vince as the first guest. He paused at the door, his breath catching, as he saw the new space, clean, bright and warm, free of the coldness Ray once brought. A small crowd gathered, protesters from before, new faces, and Tessa Brooks, who'd chosen to stay on, her smile brighter than ever. She wore a small pin reading, "Justice for All," her eyes sparkling, as she greeted Lee. "Welcome back," she said, handing him a steaming black coffee. "This one's free, and always will be, if you want." Vince approached, resting a hand on Lee's shoulder with a rare smile. "We've got something to ask you," he said, his voice low but earnest. "We want you to be an honorary advisor here, help us support folks like you, veterans who need a fresh start." Lee blinked, stunned by the offer. He looked around, seeing expectant eyes from the bikers, and a few locals. "Me?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I've got nothing to give." Vince shook his head. "You've got experience. You've got a story. That's what we need." Jamal Hayes, who'd recognized Lee from their Iraq unit, stepped up with a warm grin. "You're one of us, Carter," he said. "You belong here." As Lee mulled it over, a familiar figure emerged from the crowd. Darius Carter, his son, whom Lee hadn't seen since PTSD tore their family apart, stepped forward with red-rimmed eyes. "Dad," Darius said, his voice trembling, "I read about you online, what they did to you, what you've been through. I'm sorry I walked away." Lee's throat tightened, tears brimming as he looked at his son. He said nothing, just stepped forward and hugged Darius tight, the embrace of a father who'd lost so much and now reclaimed something precious. The crowd watched quietly, some wiping tears, feeling the weight of the moment. Valor Haven Café quickly became a symbol of inclusion in Willow Creek. People came not just for coffee, but for stories. Lee's, the bikers, and other veterans who found their way there. A wall corner was dedicated to Lee's medals and photos from his army days, brought by Jamal from their shared Iraq memories. Lee sat at the counter, coffee in hand, feeling his worth for the first time in years of being overlooked. He chatted with Vince about the early days at the new cafe, about people they'd helped, a veteran who found a job, another who got a warm place for a cold night. "I never thought I'd do anything meaningful again," Lee admitted, his voice low and reflective. Vince chuckled softly. "You've done more than you know." Willow Creek's community shifted too. Some who'd sided with Ray now showed up at Valor Haven quietly, a few offering Lee awkward handshakes of apology. Clara Evans wrote a final piece on the cafe's turnaround, calling it a beacon of hope in the town. Tessa, with newfound confidence, became a familiar face at the counter, often retelling Lee's story to new customers with pride. Lee looked around, seeing kids playing, adults talking, and bikers laughing heartily in the corner, a scene he'd never pictured when he first stepped in here. He felt a fresh start, not just for himself, but for others left behind like he once was. Leroy Lee stood on Willow Creek's familiar street, hands in the pockets of his worn army coat, but this time, the cold didn't bite as deep. He strolled through the town, once met only with wary glances and cold silence, now greeted with friendly nods from residents. An older man, who'd once shaken his head at the protest, raised a hand in greeting as Lee passed. A group of kids ran by, laughing, one waving at him like he was a known face. Lee smiled back, a small but genuine smile, rare in his years on society's fringes. Willow Creek was no longer just the place he knew from cold nights under bridges. Now it held the shape of a new beginning. He paused outside Valor Haven Café, its golden light spilling from the windows, warming the dark space. Inside, laughter and chatter rang out. Families, veterans, and locals gathered around wooden tables. Lee stepped in, his old backpack, now stashed in a familiar corner behind the counter, where he often sat with his black coffee. Tessa Brooks greeted him with a radiant smile, her Justice for All pin still gleaming on her shirt. "Your spot's here," she said, sliding a coffee his way. Lee nodded, thanks, sat down, and looked around. Kids drawing on table mats, adults sharing stories, and in the far corner, a few bikers laughing loudly over beers. This wasn't just a cafe, it was a community, a place he'd never imagined belonging to. Sitting there, Lee let his mind drift to the journey that brought him here. Just weeks ago, he'd entered Sunny Haven Café with a few coins, hoping for a coffee to warm his freezing hands. He recalled Ray Hargrove's contemptuous stare, the insults that cut deeper than the outdoor chill, and the humiliation of being tossed out like he didn't matter. But then, the bikers led by Vincent Vince Malone stepped up, turning his personal pain into a broader movement. They hadn't just pulled him from isolation, they'd changed Willow Creek step by step. Lee thought of the protest days, Ray's downfall, and the moment he hugged Jamal Hayes, the comrade from Iraq he'd thought lost forever. It all started with a simple choice: not walking away in silence. Vince walked in, his leather jacket glinting under the lights, and sat beside Lee. "You're looking good, Lee," he said, his voice rough but warm. Lee smiled faintly. "Never thought I'd be sitting here like this," he admitted, turning his coffee cup. "Not just surviving, but actually living." Vincent nodded, raising his own mug. "To new starts and justice," he said, clinking it against Lee's. They drank in silence, a wordless understanding between men who'd faced darkness and found light. Lee looked at Vince, then around the cafe, feeling the strength of unity, not just from the bikers, but from a community that stood up when it mattered. He stood and stepped outside, where the bikers' motorcycle engines rumbled as they rode off after a long day. Lee watched, their red taillights fading into the distance, leaving Willow Creek in the evening stillness. He turned back to Valor Haven Café, its light glowing like a small lighthouse in the town. Lee thought of the next generation, his son Darius Carter, now back in his life, and the kids he saw playing inside. He hoped they'd never endure what he had: discrimination, oblivion, and the loneliness of someone who gave everything with little return. Maybe, he thought, Valor Haven was a start to changing that. A place where people were judged by who they were, not their looks or circumstances. Back inside, Lee sat again, gazing out the fogged window. He saw his reflection, not the ragged homeless man anymore, but a man with new purpose. His journey, from a denied coffee to a rebuilt community, testified to the power of resilience and unexpected kindness. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. Leroy Lee's story, in Racist Cafe Owner Kicks Out Black Homeless Veteran, Unaware Who's Watching, reflects issues still plaguing U.S. society today: racism, indifference to the homeless, and veterans' struggles to reintegrate. In Willow Creek, Lee was refused service by Ray, just for his skin color and homelessness, a scenario not unfamiliar when recent reports show black and homeless people still face heavy prejudice in many U.S. public spaces. The bikers' intervention, led by Vince, and their transformation of Sunny Haven into Valor Haven Café, highlight the power of unity and collective action, seen in movements like Black Lives Matter or veteran support groups like Wounded Warrior Project. The community's gradual shift, from backing Ray to siding with Lee, mirrors a slow but clear U.S. trend: growing awareness of injustice, fueled by social media and reporting, like Clara Evans spreading Lee's tale. The lesson here isn't just unity is strength, but that real-world action can spark change. When you see someone like Lee, a homeless veteran treated unjustly, don't just quietly sympathize. Do like Vincent, speak up, use your influence, even as small as a social media post, to pressure folks like Ray. Lee's journey from outcast to Valor Haven advisor teaches us everyone has worth recognizing. Be patient in helping them reclaim their place, as the bikers did. In today's America, where millions of homeless and veterans remain overlooked, this lesson reminds us, change starts small, from a refused coffee to a rebuilt community. Act, whether with a word or a handshake, because those are what turned Willow Creek into a better place. If Lee's story and the fight for justice in Willow Creek moved you, hit that subscribe button to catch more meaningful tales. Thanks for joining us, and see you in the next video to explore more life-changing moments.